Thank you very much. So I want to talk about taking risks in the games industry and talk a little bit about our experience of the past few years, what we've been doing, what we're doing right now, and really what drives us making the games that we're making. We, as Natural Motion, are a games publisher on iOS and on Android. We've got about 220 people working on 8 games at the moment. But we actually started out as a games technology company, and that's a business that we still have. And in fact, we started as a spin out of Oxford University, trying to commercialize research that back then already looked quite risky. What we were trying to do was create interactive characters driven by neural networks and evolved by genetic algorithms and replace game animation with those principles. And this here is one of the first experiments here. This is a character that learns how to walk over time. As you can see, he's not very good at it. After a few generations of artificial evolution, which is the process that we're using here, you can see that it takes the first steps. And the point of all of this was to try and see whether we can use a different approach to animation in games that would hopefully create completely interactive characters. And as you can see, after a few more generations, this guy actually walks without falling over. And the reason we were so excited by this is it meant that if you have completely interactive animations, you have emergence. As we heard in the earlier talk from Hilma, emergence is something that is really exciting because it gives you something that you didn't plan beforehand. And I've got a simple example of this. This is actually from our product Euphoria, which is a fully interactive character simulation. And we actually had a product meeting. This was a couple of years back where we just discussing the product path for the product, but someone had 2 of our characters stand too close to each other on the screen. And we noticed that they started interacting with each other without us telling them to. And as you can see, they're starting to protect their personal space, even though that is not something that we directly put into the simulation. And this actually went on for another 20 minutes, roughly, until we eventually switched it off. And this is something that we find really exciting because it's not something that we planned. We used a different approach, and because we had all this computing power, we were now able to look at character animation in a completely different way. And we were lucky enough to be able to license this technology into some of the biggest games. Our big breakthrough was with Grand Theft Auto 4, which used our technology called Euphoria for all of its character interactions, and the most recent Grand Theft Auto 5 is using it as well as lots of other Rockstar titles like Red Dead Redemption, for example, or Max Payne 3. And Rockstar really, and I'll come back to that a little bit later, really influenced us in terms of their approach to making games, because Rockstar think ambitious in the way they approach their games, and they really think about quality, and they want to create something that really wows the user. And that's been something that ever since has been driving us as well. And something happened around this time, and that was that the iPhone came out. And for us, that was transformational. And this is one of the big things I want to talk about. The iPhone presented a huge opportunity for us because it was fast enough to run our technology in real time. So we felt that there is now an opportunity to run our technology to create experiences that reach a lot of people that they haven't been able to see before. So the reason we thought this was so exciting is because, first of all, there was now powerful hardware in everyone's hands that a lot of people could play with. Distribution had changed entirely from retail to now digital. But the business model has changed as well, because while there are paid games, you can now also have free-to-play games because digital distribution is so cheap. Now the audience is much bigger, and that means that the content that you can deliver to that audience can be much more varied too than it would be in the traditional console games market, for example. But we are also able to find out a lot about our customers through feedback and through analytics, which in itself means that we can improve the game much faster. And finally, we found that with the iPhone coming out, everything changed, but the speed of change also increased significantly. So everything changed at a very high pace, and we felt this was a huge opportunity, and this was something that we should seize. Now, when we looked at the market around that time, games looked like this, and there were a couple of things that we didn't understand about this market, and we found odd. One of them was that most of the games, even though the hardware was so powerful, still were 2D resource management games, very much taken with inspiration from Facebook. And the other thing was, and something that is still happening today, people started to copy each other a lot. So here we have 4 different zoo games from about a couple of years ago, and they all look kind of similar. And we thought this is a huge waste, because the hardware can do a lot more, and we can create experiences for people that are much bigger than was out there on Facebook on Flash games. So we wanted to do games differently, and the big risk we took, I think, around that time was that we wanted to make games that were high-end, that were essentially console games that really wowed people and made them feel they'd seen something they'd never seen before. And the reason we thought that was a viable strategy is because we noticed that on consoles, the visual evolution going from Pong to then Gran Turismo 5 and obviously GTA and Call of Duty and other games was staggering. We knew that the hardcore audience wanted to be wowed, but we believe that actually the mainstream audience wanted to be wowed exactly the same way. They don't just want to have 2D games. And we thought that because we looked at animated movies, and in animated movies there was a similar trend where we went from Snow White in the 30s to then Finding Nemo and Toy Story 3 and other 3D movies much more recently. And really the transition happened in the mid-90s, where we went from Lion King, which was still 2D, to Toy Story, obviously, which was 3D. And we believe that was evidence that you could take the risk of making a completely different kind of game for a much bigger audience and really go high-end on iPhone gaming. So that is the approach that we took. We started to build up our game studios, working with external partners and internal partners in our technology. And the first 5 games we made were all successful. The approach we felt was working, but they all shared something in common, which was that they were high-end 3D games, and they had an average return on investment of about 5 times. But we also learned a lot during that time. And one of the things that we learned, which was quite different from console gaming, was that the audience was different and it played in a different way. And in fact, when we released one of our games in usability tests, the first experience that most people had looked like this. So as you can see, pretty much everyone failed in different ways, more or less spectacular. And that's something that a hardcore gamer finds challenging, and actually a hardcore gamer wants to plow on and eventually make it through. But we found that with the audience that we were addressing, actually people found that off-putting, and they felt, actually, I'm not a gamer, this game is not for me. So what we did and what we learned with these games is we made the game much easier and made it look like this. So as you can see, what's happening now is that miraculously every time someone approaches you, they just dive past you. But you also, as the user, start to stumble a little bit. So it looks like you've done something right, but actually what we've made sure is that the football team isn't very good. And in fact, we always say this is the most incompetent football team ever to grace a video game. It never actually is able to tackle you at the beginning. But the reason we've done that is because we wanted to give you a success result at the end of your first play session. And that looked like this. It was the idea of a touchdown and you've done something right. So we try to take these risks of going high-end in a market that previously wasn't that high-end in terms of graphics, but we also try to mitigate that risk by trying to learn things. Now, our next big thing was to do something completely different, because what we felt was our games were working as paid games. They had a good return of investment, but we felt that free-to-play was going to be an even bigger opportunity. And with the learnings that we got from our previous games, we could completely abandon the old business model, take the risk of jumping into this as a free-to-play genre, and hopefully grow the business further. And that game became My Horse, which you see here. So with My Horse, not only did we swap business models altogether, but we also felt that the genre of horse games, which is not something that I was particularly interested in before, presented a huge opportunity. And going into that genre with an approach that is very high-end, uses next-generation shaders and animation technology for an audience that is certainly quite strongly skewed female, we felt was a risk worth taking because it gave us an opportunity to disrupt that particular genre. And this ended up working really well. So My Horse, where we took the risk of, as I said, going into free-to-play and taking a different approach, became our most successful game up to that point. And it gave us the confidence that actually taking risks in these markets, in a market that's growing incredibly fast, can really take off, especially if you're willing to take in the learnings from your previous games. But my horse also had a lot of problems. We knew that with my horse, the monetization wasn't as great as we wanted it to be, the game loop wasn't as well defined as we wanted it to be, and the retention wasn't as good. So for the next game that we were working on, we tried to manage those risks a little bit better, and again, try and take the learnings from my horse. And that game was CSR Racing. So CSR Racing we did because A, we wanted to improve on what we were doing with my horse. But B, also, we felt there was a big opportunity in the racing genre that wasn't really being used. And the reason for that was that we were all big fans of the racing games like real racing, like the proper racing games, as well as Asphalt and many others. But we felt that it didn't pass the Starbucks line test. So the Starbucks line test is our proxy for trying to understand whether a game session works on mobile games. And that means that you have to be able to start and finish a meaningful game session while you're waiting for your espresso to be delivered at Starbucks. And we felt that if you could take the racing genre and make it compatible with the Starbucks line test, you could create something that can be much more successful than anything else before in that genre, and that became CSR Racing. And the approach that we took was to go for drag racing. So all you had to do was drive in a straight line, and we had a lot of people saying back then that that makes no sense because racing is about steering. But we felt that racing isn't about steering. Racing is about competing against other people. And in fact, it's very often just looking at which car is faster, as long as you kind of get the shifts right. And we knew that that was big because on YouTube there are lots of videos, and you can see one example here of a Bugatti Veyron against an M3 that just pitted one car against another one and had huge viewing numbers. So we felt that actually, even though this is a completely different way of doing racing, it isn't actually as risky as it first seems. Now, the other thing that we found important was that we wanted people to feel ownership of the cars that they were comparing their cars against. But we also wanted the cars to be beautiful. We spent a lot of time on making the game look good, making them do justice, or making the graphics do justice to the actual manufacturers that we had, because we wanted to have you feel a sense of ownership, and we allowed you to customize those cars, again, to really drive home that sense of ownership. Now, I was saying earlier that we already learned from previous games that people on mobile play these games differently than they do on console. So we tried to learn from that too, and the backbreaker clip that I showed earlier, we made the game quite easy at the beginning. We did the same with CSR Racing because we didn't want to run the risk of people abandoning the game because it was too difficult. So we made the first race basically unusable. We put you into a BMW 125i, pitted you against, I think, a Nissan Almera with the AI completely turned down. Every shift is basically screwed up. It's a super weak car, so you should just plow ahead. And when we were playing the first few sessions and versions of this, we thought this is not a game anymore. This is un-losable. But it actually turned out when we eventually released, 36% of users lost that first game. And again, it shows you how different this audience can be, and particularly if you go mass market. CSR is at around 70 million downloads now. If you go mass market, the audience is very different. But if you can understand that, then you can actually mitigate the risks of doing new games for this audience. Now, the other thing that we found important was we realized that if you have a game that hopefully looks different to other people's games and is something that is a really rich experience, you can play the game differently to other people. You can have a different business model, and our business model is not based on user acquisition. We believe that if you take the risk of doing a new type of game, you don't have to do that much user acquisition. In fact, for CSR Racing, we didn't do any user acquisition for the first 6 months. Every user that came in was fully organic. And the reason was that we built the game in such a way that you would want to show it off to your friends. So when you start the game, you see the workshop of your car and it looks beautiful in it. You want to show it off to your friends, and that's how we gained most of our users. We now do some user acquisition, but it's still much, much smaller than most other games. Now, you can combine that with digital virality, and you can see here T-Pain actually tweeting about his car, which again drives additional users.
I want you to show me this game that you're playing.
Here we have Juan Pablo Montoya showing the game off on Fox Sports, actually, and showing off basically the best of both worlds. Analog virality, showing the game off and tweeting about it afterwards.
Quarter-mile races, and you buy the car and you tune it, and look, let me...
You're not a rookie.
He pushed rookie. But then I'll look.
he actually, again, goes on for quite some time showing off the different cars. And I think it's funny that a NASCAR racing driver spends a lot of his time sitting in the pit stop actually playing a game on his iPad and having fun there. And that's not even a game where you steer, you just go in a straight line. But it's this combination of things that we think is really attractive. If you create a game that hasn't been there before, if you take the risk, you're essentially in a blue ocean. You don't have to compete with other games. People will talk about your game because they want to talk about it because it's new and it's newsworthy. And that means that you don't have the issue that you have if you copy other people's games, if you fast follow other people's games, where eventually you're all playing at the same playing field, at the same level, and you eventually end up having to do a lot of user acquisition. So this worked out really well for us, and CSR Racing became the #1 top grossing game worldwide. It made over $12 million in the first month alone. It's still generating very strong revenues to this date. And we were celebrating, we made lots of cakes. We couldn't believe how much money you could make on the App Store. We actually had cake and champagne every time revenues went up, which was for quite some time. It was getting pretty ridiculous towards the end. But it gave us a lot of confidence that doing something different, taking risks, and not following other people's games in this market, which is growing so fast, can give you incredible returns. And we learned a lot after that as well, because not only was the game out, when it was out, we had to obviously update the game, we had to support it, we grew our teams, we learned a lot out of that, we put live updates out for the game as well. But it gave us more and more confidence that this strategy of taking risks works, as long as you are conscious that you have to learn from your previous games, that you don't know that much, and that you can manage risks in a way that actually makes it safer to run a company taking risks on making new original IP than to follow other people's games. And one of the big things that we're doing now, and one of the things I want to talk about finally, is how do you build a company around that? How do you build a company around taking risks that hopefully becomes a big entertainment powerhouse? And this is what we've been working on for the last probably 18 months. Even before CSR was released, we're trying to build an organization that allows us to take the best from our existing games and apply it to new games, so that with every game we can take a risk and create original IP that hasn't been there before. And one of the things that we found extremely important is to scale the way we do communication across the company. As I said, we've got 220 people now, we've got 5 different studios, and we try and make sure that we learn from each other. And one of the things I'm showing here is we do product offsites. At the moment we're doing them about every 2 weeks or once a month, where we get everyone together and we analyze other people's games and we analyze our own games, and we try and extract the best principle from those games, but then completely reapply them to a different kind of game. We're doing that because making iPhone games and Android games is hard, making free-to-play games is even harder, but combining that with hopefully completely new gameplay is even harder still. And scaling that up is probably one of the biggest risks that we're taking right now. But we think it's a huge opportunity, because if not now, when is there an opportunity to build a big next generation entertainment company that creates new IP? We find that incredibly exciting as an opportunity. We don't believe that fast following and essentially copying other people's games is the way forward. We think that's actually much more risky than taking risks on new IP. And one of the examples of the games that probably best represents that is a game called Clumsy Ninja that is coming out soon. And Clumsy Ninja is about, it's the first fully interactive character on iOS devices. It's about taking everything we know in terms of technology, making that run fast enough, creating fully interactive characters, gameplay design, and free-to-play design, and trying to put that into something that becomes a truly magical experience. Will this work the way we want it to work? We don't know yet. We don't know until the game is out in the market. But we're trying everything we can, whether it's user testing, design sessions, communications between product managers, to make this a successful game. And this is really what we live for. It's this opportunity to build something that we can be truly proud of, that is something that is new, that is risky, and that we can look back at when we are 70 or 80 years old and think, we did that. And this is the thing that drives us, and that's why we think taking risks right now is by far the most successful strategy in building a company for next generation games. Thanks very much.